Belford Ulanov's book, The Wisdom of the Psyche. And the chapter is entitled The Wisdom of the Psyche. I know that most of you were busy preparing for Christmas Eve and Christmas, so I will have a small following tonight, but nonetheless, I want to get this onto the channel. So I'm reading from page 121 of Dr. Ulanov's book, part 2. Some of the questions asked after the materials of the first 3 chapters were delivered as lectures sharply Some of the questions asked after the materials of the first 3 chapters were delivered as lectures sharply address the points I have been trying to make about the place of the psyche in the religious scheme of things. An important question is how the ego houses what belongs to it, and especially its own little evils, and, as a corollary, how might the church look that really took up this task? To house means just that. It means not to suppress or repress or extinguish anything. We are giving house room. It does not mean having one's psyche all tidied up, marched to order, everything understood. Those neatenings and straightenings reflect only an obsessive hygiene, a self-defeating urge to surface perfections. Housing means space, awareness, making room in consciousness for all the unknown presences that exist in us, between us, among us. I often say to students that while we sit and talk, behind me looms an alligator, and behind you a leopard, and over there a hyena. Do we know about these astonishing presences? Chances are we do not. More likely, the other person over there will know before I do about my alligator or your leopard. They exist. Chances are we do not. More likely, the other person over there will know before I do about my alligator or your leopard. They exist, but we remain unconscious of them. To house them does not mean we must transform them into some little lizards in an aquarium on a living room table. It means we must know that alligators and leopards and hyenas live with us in our premises. Go to a zoo and look at an alligator. Look into its eyes. It does not look back at you. It has its own independent life that respects such independence. Housing means a management. There must be provision, a space where the alligator can go. You have to keep your eye on it, get to know its habits and what it likes to eat, whether it looks back at you or not. After 100 years of analysis and other related forms of gaining self-knowledge, there one is with the same old alligator. After 100 years of analysis and other related forms of gaining self-knowledge, there one is with the same old alligator. Has anything changed? Yes, our knowledge of it, our awareness of its habits, our ability to protect our toes and those of other people from its bites. The achievement and the limitation both convict us of our finitude. On an interpersonal level, things get complicated. Spaces get crowded with one's own alligator, the other's leopard, and the third one's hyena. They not only get crowded, they become dangerous. Our alligators may start nibbling on the fingers of our neighbors, who may react violently, yelling at us, "Cut that out." We say, "Cut what out?" Oblivious but not innocent of what is going on. Nasty conflicts blow up. Translate this conversation into politics or labor disputes to see how serious this sort of thing can be. Take peace talks between warring nations as an example. Assume good faith on all sides. Everyone sincerely wants improvement of communications, reduction of fear along the reduction of fear, along with reduction of arms, and increase of trust between the warring peoples. That is the conscious intention, comfortably avowed by all. But unconsciously, the opposite state of affairs exists. We have a zoo full of animals tearing at the bars to get at each other and everyone who comes to stare at them. We do not see the alligators, leopards, and hyenas of greed. We do not recognize the hate and power seeking as belonging to ourselves. It always comes from others. So we are ready to attack and fight. That way we can go on disowning the alligators that belong to us and farm them out to the enemy. We must withdraw such projections and claim our own beasts if anything resembling peace is to break out. In the small as well as the large conflict, that means making conscious room for battalions of alligators, or never breaking down the barriers between our consciously seeking agreement and our unconsciously refusing it. See our own animals, see those that belong to others. We need to notice that those others also have projections onto us, and we must remember that projections are not mere phantasms. They can kill. Their alligators now, not ours, may be biting at our feet, threatening us, leaving us with no safe land to stand upon. Withdrawing our own projections will help a great deal, but it is not a cure-all. We must be aware that projections come from all sides, so that we may not be controlled by them, any of them, ours or theirs or anyone's. When contesting parties struggle to deal with their projections, a way is open to see the differences that remain between them, even though both seek the same goal, namely peace. Seeing the other this way aids understanding. For example, to study the literature of modern Russia and its spirituality, however vestigial, will give us a view from the ground up of what power and powerlessness mean from a Soviet point of view, what suffering means to the Russians, what such a people is willing to live and die for. The resultant perception must change our understanding of how to speak to the Soviets. Of course, this book was written in 1986, and so it was before the end of the Soviet Union. Jung is a depth psychologist who wrestled his whole life with these matters. It is amazing that a 20th century analyst should take up the issue of the Trinity, or the Mass, or the problem of evil, or the nature of God, and with so much openness to the issues involved, ancient and modern. Still, if you insist on reading his answer to Job as a metaphysical statement, serious problems arise. Jung himself advises us against taking his book that way, as an ontology. See it, he says, rather as his own subjective emotive confession. It is important advice. One of the shifts we are undergoing is a result of depth psychology. One of the shifts we are undergoing as a result of depth psychology is away from easy security in intellectual constructs. Instead, now we have a plethora of subjective confessions and wrestlings toward personal solution that we pool and share, sometimes profitably, sometimes not so well. My understanding of Jung is that he finally did not know where to put the bad. He could not get a net over it, but he could not and did not deny or repress it. But he could not and did not deny or repress it. He struggled with it. His personal life and his life with women show this struggle, and even the nastiness that inheres in it. In his autobiography, he writes obliquely of having done terrible things, but that he could not help himself. The unpublished parts of his book, apparently censored by his family, said a great deal more. What I think he was saying was, I did not create myself this way. If I think it is all my fault, I shall never be able to get out of bed again. So God must have something to do with it. That is where he put the bad, into and onto God. God, like Jung, struggled with evil and unconsciousness. God needs Job's vociferous objection to the undeserved suffering inflicted upon him to call to God's conscious attention God's own evil side. For God, for Jung, this solution to his problem, masquerading as Job's, worked. He could see then our efforts to struggle consciously with our own shadow sides, with all the opposites in conflict within us, as our way of participating in God's life and of carrying the incarnation onward, the process of sanctification in Christianity, which brings souls to blessedness, was consciously an acceptance of this conflict with our evil shadow sides. And God, in fact, depends on us to do just this. This attitude of Jung's holds some of the appeal that the Zoroastrian religion holds. We can line up on the same side with God, with Ahura Mazda, the fight for the good against the forces of darkness. For Jung, the saving good was consciousness. God needs our consciousness. For myself, I think that is simply where Jung projected his particular struggle and particular God image onto God. God causes the bad because God is not sufficiently conscious. That is Jung's symbolic equation. That is where the ladder of his images ended, and the gap between him and God was foreclosed. Openness was not allowed its own space. When we look to the church and extend the task of housing what belongs to us, we see a shift in the psychological nature of that institution. Generally, the church has been identified with a superego function. When the church is asked to do its work of housing, it is its ego function that dominates. The church has long had to suffer identification as cultural superego, in spite of all the awkwardnesses. Sorry. The church has long had to suffer identification as cultural superego, in spite of all the awkwardnesses of the term and its applications. Freud's superego concept has survived in the basic psychological vocabulary against gross distortions that reduce the superego to nothing but a crabbed list of thou shalt nots, a moralizing apodictic set of prescriptions, particularly against any glad acceptance of aggression or sexuality. Such a reduction of the church is constricting and unprofitable, not to say false. In defense of Freud, it must be said In defense of Freud, it must be said he understood by the superego something that can be an immensely positive force in the psyche if it has developed its powers in primarily beneficent ways. A good working superego is like a fund of money in the bank. It is a rich resource of energy to draw upon when needed. It is a steady wind behind one's sail. This energy, these resources, feel natural and powerful when they are at full strength, available and accessible. They make us feel possible. We have permission to do what we choose feels right to do. We have strong backing, so to speak, that garners community support, connects to others, and promotes our projects with others. We are not punished now, but supported by our superego, not restricted, but guided. The full weight of the collective system stands behind those individuals succeeding, not only for themselves, but for all those with whom they share their lives. When the church is associated with this sort of positive superego, it is experienced as life-giving. Here is a superego friendly to the ego. Here is a superego friendly to the ego without being wishy-washy, with an open attitude that accepts behavior rather than censures it. The superego does not stand apart in this guise, either wagging its finger at the ego. Instead, the superego instructs, inspires, encourages. Goodness knows we need that from the church. We need to hear from the church simply, clearly, that there is a God, that there is joy and life abundantly. I would not want to see the church lose this extraordinary positive superego function. Curiously, however, I think we cannot see it nor understand it unless we shift our attention to the church's ego functions. The church's ego role is space making, to offer a firm and big enough space that people trust enough to bring all of themselves into it, the bad, the troubled, the uncertain, the vengeful and resentful parts of ourselves, and the eager, lively, glad, and ambitious parts. All are invited to the banquet. Feeling thus housed and held in being, people can risk examining who they really are. They can go right into what makes them anxious. They can look at their murderous responses to other people, other congregations, other sects, other countries that both fascinate and frighten them. In the ego role, the church encourages awareness of what really goes on in our secret hearts, in our actual ways of living in our families, with our friends, at work, in society and parish, in every part of our world, in our actual experiences and beliefs before God. In our actual experiences and beliefs about God, for a very large space is needed. Overdose, I will come back to your questions when I finish this reading. I have a couple more pages. None of this is to make the church into a kind of collectivized ego with all its possibilities of tyranny and control. Rather, it is only to speak of the church metaphorically, as if it participated in ego functions. Again, a gap intercedes. That is, as if figure of speech describes the ego as space maker more than as master. For better or worse, the church is the place in Christendom where space is made for shared consciousness of our roots in being. Here we may sort through the good and the bad. Here we may dare to confess where we were wrong. Here we may reach to gratitude. Here we may remember and circle round the good which announced itself in person, not as a perfect utopian good, but as a related one. Here we circle round all the joys of that contradictory but grace-filled world. Rilke's words might be read as the church's, quote, "I am circling round God, around the ancient tower. And I have been circling for 1,000 years, and I still don't know if I am a falcon or a storm or a great song. When we think of the church as if it were a space of ego consciousness in Christendom, we include pre-ego levels of life too. Indeed, this is all that such a ego consciousness would be, open to impulses, instincts, to indefinable, irrational perceptions and apperceptions of reality that are not yet differentiated into object and subject. This is a level of being which for centuries was recognized as an achievement of mystic consciousness. This, sturdy sort of space making and housing conducted by the church ego brings a quality of listening to the dialogue between persons speaking to and hearing each other, which supersedes the content of what is being said. The church that houses all that comes into it, that houses the gap between what we know and what we can never be and what never can be known, contains both the archaic foundation of belief and all that we now mean by grace. This sort of church offers space for people to allow the unconscious to function, fostering that full sense of the other we call empathy at the deepest level. Such a church happily entertains much silence in its services and is strong enough to face much violence. To take just one example, this church could face and try to make space for violence done to women and to children, to know it and acknowledge its sources so as to combat and overcome it. Whether such violence is on the increase or simply our consciousness of it, it is too much with us. Any of it is too much. From a psychological point of view, violence toward women and children presents us with a grim example of projection and sadism. To put it theoretically, the feminine modality of being is being literally equated with females. Males who cannot tolerate their own feminine side feel almost impossibly threatened. Such men may feel as if they were drowning in an ocean or completely absorbed in women's thoughts, feelings, bodies, as the mass murderer Charles Manson said he did. A patient once said to me, "Woman is like primeval ooze, a quicksand that will suck you down, and then you're gone." The violent male projects terrifying threat onto the female and then feels compelled to beat it out of her. Woman does not exist as a person in her own right for a man of this kind. She is equated with what he fears and fears all the more as he beats what he fears by beating her. She is absorbed in his fantasy. She is absorbed in his fantasy, just as he fears he will be absorbed and disappear in her. That is why consciousness of the feminine mode in oneself is so absolutely crucial. To relieve women of this assaulting terror and to make us see that we need to bring our dread of that mode of being into open consciousness where we can control how we relate to it. Theoretically, children carry a different symbolic meaning, representing our dependence, our helplessness, our smallness and vulnerability, all our creative possibilities for a living future. That is what is abused, beaten, molested, ridiculed by child abusers. Their projections onto children, which may in fact be our projections, must be recalled into conscious responsibility. But we cannot wait until everyone recalls his or her projection. We need all kinds of social management to protect children and women from abuse. Laws, effective treatment for abusers, and abused sanctuaries for the most threatened and threatening. Finally, a church functioning as space maker can house the gap we all know between our God images and God. It is not the place where the gap is overcome, though the church points brick by brick to our hope in that promise. Those of you who are clergy, who work in the trenches of day-to-day church life, can give many examples of the conflict, the sullenness, the sloth, the hate, the not being able to stay awake to what matters, that are everyday commonplaces in the church. The composer Stravinsky was impressive on that score. He said when interviewed by the New York Times in his late 80s, "I want to be awake, awake." Only God overcomes the gap in bits and pieces, in individual souls, communally. The church can help us ready ourselves for grace, help us to spy it, to take it when it comes, to use it. A layperson can tell us in a moment whether a church space will help in the soul tasks. It is a matter of atmosphere, a scent, a spirit in the air that tells us quickly whether the clergy are wrestling with the same gap in themselves, struggling with the gap between God images and what is revealed in Scripture and tradition, and by what God may seem to be saying to us today. From a psychological point of view, no separation exists among us at the unconscious level. We touch each other in the depths of the unconscious and mix with one another. So if the clergy are struggling with these issues, the congregation will feel the effects. It makes a space for others to do it. We make spiritual contributions to each other in this way, for good or for ill. A church conscious that the unconscious exists would allow silences, gaps in actual rituals, to see what might surprise us. Good Friday services, in particular, I think, need a great deal more silence, many more of the great empty spaces in which we can feel the impact of the effort of the sorry. I think we need a great deal more silence, many more of the great empty spaces in which we can feel the impact of the emptiness that suffering opens, like a yawning cavern beneath our feet. Attention should also be given in church to the weight of projections that fall upon the clergy, where a congregation unconsciously demands that the priest fit its needs for mother or father or surrogate lover or wise man or whipping boy or good sister or ministering angel. For a congregation to feel its clergy struggling with the gap between God and its God images not only makes spiritual space, but also an effective spiritual combat against the assault of projections. The best defense against people projecting onto us is to live our own reality to the full. That is the way we really show ourselves to others. What they may want or need us to be, or try to coerce us into being, then simply falls away. The discrepancy between the image of us they carry and who we really are collapses. That is where the gap saves us. Okay, so that is part 2 of this 4th chapter of Dr. Ulanov's book, The Wisdom of the Psyche. And this 4th chapter is called The Wisdom of the Psyche. And I will do my best to read part 3 of this chapter, which is only 5 pages long, a little later this evening. And so let me just quickly look at the comments. Info says, do you think that understanding religion psychologically is enough to satisfy the religious desire in humans? No, I don't think so. I think that you need to feel it, you need to know. And so an understanding of religion is helpful because it points the way to knowing, but it isn't knowing. And Nick says, I feel it isn't enough. It has to be understood with the body as well, absolutely, without the metaphysical component. Info Overdose suggests that without the metaphysical component, and I would say, well, the metaphysical component is needed. In other words, you need to know. And so you can understand psychology all you want, but until you've had an experience of God in an appropriate way, it's kind of meaningless. I mean, you can go to church and you can go through all the motions, but if you haven't had a emotional reaction to the service, then it's just meaningless. But that's what all religions do. They all run you through the paces, whether it's Buddhism or Christianity or Hinduism or any other religion. And eventually, if you trust in it, you grok it, you get it, you experience something that tells you that you're on the right track. Now, I described this in great detail in my presentation at Unity by the Bay called Finding the Living God. And I would urge you, if you haven't seen that video, to look for it. Let me just see if I have it here. I'm sorry, I don't have the link handy. Oh, here it is. Okay, so if you go to this link, there are two links there. One is without the slides, and one is with the slides. The one with the slides has been edited to take out all of my speaking goofs, and so you probably want to watch that one. I'm not sure which one this link is. And Winston's mom says, thank you, Skip. This is such a lovely way to spend a lovely Christmas Eve evening. Do you need a Kleenex? Says she gently. We appreciate your reading, and everyone, please hit like. Thank you very much, Winston's mom, for that. The likes are helpful. I have a 13% asthma, which will be chronic with me for the rest of my life. And so I have a sort of a congenital sniffle, but in this case, I'm just fighting back a cold. And I was not as emotional as I was this morning trying to read Yes, Virginia, There Is a Santa Claus, and The Night Before Christmas, which I read earlier in the day because Christmas was already upon Japan and Australia at the time. And so I did read those earlier today. I'm a little teary-eyed in it because they touch me at a deep emotional level, which tells me they're archetypal. And my door has just opened, suggesting that I need to end this and go have my dinner. And hopefully I'll be able to finish this evening. I'll see you later. Thank you for joining me today.